close your eyes and let time slip away. Imagine a world where marble cities touch the sky, where philosophers whispered truths under moonlight, and where a single spark of knowledge set the entire world aglow. This is the splendor of ancient Greece. This is the quiet echo of Alexandria's lost wisdom. And this is a story of how the brightest light in human history slowly faded into silence. Tonight, we journey through forgotten brilliance, a story not of battles, but of minds, not of kings, but of libraries. So lie back, breathe slow, and drift into the soft glow of a history that once lit the world. The Splendor of Greece. The century and a half that came after the defeat of Persia was, without a doubt, one of the most brilliant and glorious eras in the entire history of Greek civilization. Yes, it's true that Greece, during this time, was not at peace. It was deeply divided and torn apart by a fierce and relentless struggle for power, a rivalry between Athens, Sparta, and other powerful city-states. This conflict reached its peak during what is known as the Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 BC, a long, bitter war that left deep scars. And later, in the year 338 BC, the Macedonians rose in power and became, in effect, the rulers of Greece. Yet, despite all this political chaos and military conflict, the spirit of the Greek people did not falter. In fact, during this very period, Greek thought, creativity, and artistic expression soared to unimaginable heights. Their philosophers questioned the nature of life and reality. Their artists sculpted beauty from stone. Their playwrights gave voice to human emotion and tragedy. And their achievements in knowledge, in art, in the way they thought about the world became a guiding light for humanity, a lamp burning through time that would continue to inspire all of history that followed. The heart and center of this remarkable wave of intellectual and artistic activity was none other than Athens. For more than 30 years, from 466 to 428 BC, Athens was guided and inspired by a man of extraordinary energy and open-mindedness, Pericles. He was not just a political leader, he was a visionary. When the Persians had left the city in ruins, reduced to ashes, it was Pericles who took on the monumental task of rebuilding it. The breathtaking ruins that still stand in Athens today, those majestic temples and grand structures, are mostly the result of his ambitious rebuilding efforts. But Pericles didn't stop at restoring stone and marble. He also revived Athens intellectually. He transformed it into a radiant center of thought, learning, and creativity. Around him, he gathered not just architects and sculptors, but poets, playwrights, philosophers, and teachers, the brightest minds of the age. In 438 BC, the great historian Herodotus came to Athens to recite his historical works. Anaxagoras arrived as well, bringing with him the first attempts at a scientific understanding of the sun and stars. And in the world of drama, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, one after another, elevated Greek theater to unparalleled heights of beauty, depth, and nobility. Together, they shaped a golden era, a time when Athens was not just a city, but a beacon of human brilliance. The powerful momentum that Pericles gave to the intellectual life of Athens did not end with his death. His influence lingered like a flame that continued to burn brightly, even as the world around it began to darken. Even though peace in Greece had now been shattered by the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War and a long, draining, and ultimately destructive struggle for dominance had begun, the spirit of thought and inquiry in Athens remained alive. Remarkably, the looming shadow of political unrest, the uncertainty, the tension, the threat of conflict did not silence the minds of men. On the contrary, it seemed to stir them, to awaken them more deeply. It was as if the darkening skies over Greece only made the light of reason burn more fiercely. Rather than being discouraged, people were inspired to think, to question, and to create perhaps even more urgently as the world around them grew more unstable. Long before the era of Pericles, the political and social structure of Greece had already set the stage for a unique kind of intellectual growth. Unlike many ancient societies where power was held tightly by kings or religious priests, Greece was different. Here, important decisions were made not by a single ruler, but through open discussions in public assemblies made up of citizens or influential leaders. This meant that having the ability to speak clearly, argue persuasively, and present ideas logically wasn't just useful, it was essential. If you wanted to lead, or even just to be heard, you needed to know how to debate. Because of this, public speaking, or what we now call rhetoric, became a prized skill in Greek life. Naturally, a group of teachers emerged to meet this demand. They were called the sophists. These were professional educators who specialized in teaching young men how to become effective speakers and debaters. They trained their students in the art of persuasion, helping them construct arguments, speak with confidence, and win discussions whether in politics, law, or everyday life. But here's where things became interesting. You can't argue effectively without knowing something real, without facts, logic, and substance behind your words. So, as the sophists taught speaking skills, they also unintentionally encouraged a broader search for knowledge. People began examining not just what was said, but how it was said and whether the reasoning made any real sense. This led to a deeper questioning of truth itself. What makes a good argument? What is logic? What is real knowledge? And what is just clever talk? Out of this rising sea of questions, one man began to stand out: Socrates. After the death of Pericles, Socrates became increasingly well known in Athens, not as a teacher in the usual sense, but as a relentless questioner. He had a sharp mind and a fearless tongue, and he used them to expose faulty reasoning wherever he found it, especially among the sophists. Many of them, he believed, were less interested in truth and more interested in winning arguments, even if their reasoning was weak or dishonest. Socrates walked the streets of Athens, engaging people in conversation, challenging their ideas, and pushing them to think more deeply. His method was simple but powerful. Ask question after question until the truth or the lack of it became clear. He quickly gained a following. A group of talented and curious young men gathered around him, drawn by his wisdom and his fearless pursuit of truth. But his influence also stirred discomfort. Many in power felt threatened by his constant questioning. They believed he was encouraging the youth to challenge authority, traditions, and the established way of thinking. Eventually, in the year 399 BC, the Athenian authorities put Socrates on trial. They accused him of corrupting the minds of the young and of disrespecting the gods of the city. He was found guilty, but his execution was carried out in a characteristically Athenian way. Socrates wasn't taken to prison or executed in public. Instead, he was given a cup of poison, a deadly drink made from the plant hemlock, and instructed to drink it quietly in his own home, surrounded by his closest friends. And so Socrates died. But the movement he had started, the deep, thoughtful questioning of truth, ethics, and reason, did not die with him. His students, the young men who had once gathered to learn from him, continued his mission. They carried his torch forward, ensuring that his legacy would shape the future of philosophy not just in Greece, but across the world. Among the many young men who were influenced by Socrates, one stood out more than all the rest. His name was Plato, and he would go on to become one of the most important thinkers in all of Western history. He was born in 427 BC and lived until 347 BC. In time, Plato began teaching philosophy himself, continuing the tradition of deep questioning and intellectual exploration that Socrates had begun. He chose as his place of teaching a peaceful and shady grove known as the Academy, and from this came the very word academy, which we still use today for places of learning. Plato's teachings were wide-ranging, but they mainly focused on two great subjects. First, he explored the foundations and methods of human thinking, asking, how do we know what we know? What is truth? What is real? And what is illusion? Second, he turned his attention to the world of politics and society. He examined how governments function, how laws are made, and how people live together in communities. He wasn't just interested in describing the world as it was, he wanted to imagine how it could be. He was, in fact, the first person in recorded history to write what we now call a utopia, a detailed vision of a society that was completely different from, and far better than, the world around him. This act, dreaming up a whole new kind of society, was something astonishing. Before Plato, most people simply accepted the customs, laws, and social rules they were born into, without question. Plato dared to ask, what if there's a better way to live? He said, very directly, to all of humanity. Many of the problems you suffer, the unfairness, the conflicts, the failures in your governments, these are not beyond your control. You have the power to change them if only you find the courage and the will. You can build a wiser, fairer world, but first, you must think it through and then work to make it real. You don't even realize how much power you truly have. This was an incredibly bold and adventurous message, one that, even today, has not fully reached or transformed the thinking of most people. One of Plato's earliest and most famous works was called The Republic. In it, he imagined a kind of ideal society ruled not by wealth or birth, but by wisdom. It was a vision of a community led by philosopher kings, where property was shared and the good of all came before the desires of a few. Toward the end of his life, Plato was still working on these ideas. His last and unfinished book was called The Laws, where he outlined detailed rules and structures for another ideal society, one built, once again, on reason, justice, and thoughtful design. Though these were only visions on the page, they opened up a whole new way of thinking, showing that society itself could be shaped, improved, and even reimagined. The work of examining how humans think and how they govern themselves did not end with Plato's death. It was taken forward by another great thinker, a man who had been Plato's student. His name was Aristotle. He taught at another famous school in Athens called the Lyceum. Aristotle was not originally from Athens. He came from a city called Stagira, located in the northern region of Macedonia. His father had served as the royal physician to the king of Macedonia, which meant that Aristotle grew up close to the world of courts, kings, and political power. Because of this connection, Aristotle was chosen to become the tutor of the young Prince Alexander, the same Alexander who would one day become known as Alexander the Great. But long before Alexander marched across the world, Aristotle was busy studying the foundations of human knowledge. While Plato had imagined ideal societies, Aristotle took a more practical path. He believed that before we could shape a better world, we first had to understand the one we already lived in detail and with accuracy. He focused intensely on how people think, how arguments are built, and how ideas are tested. His work gave rise to the formal study of logic, the science of correct reasoning, and Aristotle did it so thoroughly, with such precision, that his logical system remained the standard for more than 500 years. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that scholars in Europe, known as the schoolmen, picked up those same questions again and tried to build upon them. Unlike Plato, Aristotle didn't dream up perfect societies, he didn't write utopias. Instead, he looked at the world as it was and asked, what do we truly know? How do we learn more? And what kind of knowledge do we need if we ever hope to take control of our destiny, as Plato had imagined? Aristotle realized something crucial. Before people could build a just and wise society, they needed far more knowledge, and not just any knowledge, but accurate and tested knowledge. And so, he began what we now call the scientific method. He sent out explorers and observers to gather facts from nature. He studied animals, plants, the skies, and the workings of the human body. He is rightly called the father of natural history, the first to look at the natural world, not with myth or imagination, but with observation and reason. He also laid the foundation for political science, the systematic study of governments and how they function. At his school, the Lyceum, his students undertook a massive project. They studied and compared the constitutions of 158 different city-states. They asked what worked, what failed, and why. Aristotle didn't just want knowledge for its own sake. He wanted understanding that could help guide human life wisely, rationally, and effectively. His legacy is not one of dreams, but of disciplined learning, the first great blueprint for the world of science. By the 4th century BC, we begin to see something truly remarkable in human history, the rise of thinkers who were, in many ways, almost modern in their mindset. The old ways of thinking, childlike, dreamlike, and filled with superstition, had begun to fade away. Gone were the days when the mysteries of life were explained only through myths, gods with strange powers, and terrifying monsters that lived in legends. Gone, too, were the taboos and sacred fears that once silenced human curiosity. In their place, something new had emerged, a bold, disciplined, and critical approach to the questions of existence. Instead of relying on imagination and symbolism to understand the world, these new thinkers began using logic, observation, and reason. They asked real questions and demanded real answers. They didn't just wonder what was true, they asked why and how. For the first time in recorded history, thinking had become truly free, precise, systematic, unburdened by fear or ancient tradition. It was as if a fresh wind had blown through the ancient temples, sweeping aside the dust of superstition and letting the light of day pour in. These were minds that had come, figuratively speaking, out of the wild northern forest, minds that were not weighed down by centuries of ritual and belief. They entered the sacred spaces of thought, examined everything that had once been kept in the shadows, and shone a new kind of light upon it, all the light of reason. In this moment, the foundation of true philosophy and science had been laid, and the world would never be the same again. The museum and library at Alexandria. Even before the time of Alexander the Great, the Greeks had already begun to spread far beyond the borders of their homeland. They traveled not as conquerors, but as merchants, artists, scholars, government officials, and mercenary soldiers moving steadily across much of the vast Persian Empire. In fact, long before Alexander ever raised a sword, the Greek presence was already being felt deep within the ancient world. One remarkable episode from this period occurred after the death of the Persian king Xerxes. In the chaos of dynastic struggles that followed, a force of 10,000 Greek mercenaries took part in the fighting. They were led by a Greek named Xenophon, not only a capable commander, but also a gifted writer. Xenophon later described their incredible journey home, a long and dangerous march from deep within Babylon all the way back to Greek territory in Asia Minor. His account, titled The Retreat of the 10,000, is one of the very first true war stories ever written by a general who actually led the campaign. It gave the world a vivid look into the harsh realities of ancient warfare and the courage it took to survive. But it wasn't until the conquest of Alexander that this Greek presence exploded across the known world. When Alexander swept through the Persian Empire, and when, after his death, his massive empire was divided among his top generals, the spread of Greek culture gained unstoppable momentum. Wherever the Greeks went, they brought more than weapons. They brought their language, their fashion, their art, architecture, and ideas, their way of thinking. This process, often called Hellenization, began to influence cities, customs, and entire cultures from Egypt to India. Traces of this Greek influence can be found as far as Central Asia and Northwest India, astonishing distances from Greece itself. In fact, the impact of Greek culture on Indian art was especially deep and long-lasting. The graceful curves, the sculptural styles, the human realism that entered Indian religious art, much of it was inspired by the fusion of Greek aesthetics with local traditions. The ancient world, once divided by cultures and borders, was beginning to merge into something new, a world touched and forever changed by the legacy of Greece. For many centuries after its golden age, Athens continued to hold on to its reputation as a shining center of art, philosophy, and culture. Its influence didn't simply vanish after the rise of Alexander. Far from it. In fact, its famous schools of learning remained active all the way until the year 529 AD. That's nearly 1,000 years of continuous intellectual activity, an extraordinary legacy by any measure. But over time, the leadership in the world of thought and science began to shift. It crossed the Mediterranean Sea from Athens to a new and rapidly growing city, Alexandria. Alexandria was a city founded by Alexander the Great himself, strategically located at the mouth of the Nile River. It quickly became a hub of trade, culture, and learning, a crossroads between East and West. After Alexander's death, one of his trusted generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt. He didn't just rule, he declared himself pharaoh, becoming the new king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was no ordinary ruler. Before becoming king, he had been one of Alexander's closest companions. He was deeply influenced by the ideas of Aristotle, and he brought that passion for knowledge with him to Alexandria. Ptolemy spoke Greek, and so did his court, making Alexandria a Greek-speaking capital at the heart of Egypt. But more importantly, he had a vision. He wanted to build a city of learning, a place where all human knowledge could be gathered, organized, and expanded. With energy, ambition, and skill, Ptolemy set out to create just that. He supported scholars, built libraries, and encouraged investigation in every field of science and thought. His efforts laid the foundation for what would become the legendary Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. Ptolemy also wrote a detailed account of Alexander's epic military campaigns. Sadly, that work has been lost to time. But even though we no longer have his words, the impact of his efforts in building Alexandria into an intellectual powerhouse is still felt today. In this way, the torch of learning passed from Athens to Alexandria, and the pursuit of knowledge entered a bold new chapter. Even before Alexandria rose to greatness, Alexander the Great had shown a personal interest in advancing human knowledge. He had already provided Aristotle, his former tutor, with generous financial support to pursue philosophical and scientific inquiry. But it was Ptolemy I, the ruler who inherited Egypt after Alexander's death, who took things a step further. He became the first person in history to make a permanent endowment for science, an institution designed to last beyond any one lifetime. In Alexandria, Ptolemy established a remarkable foundation. It was dedicated to the Muses, the divine inspirations of the arts and sciences in Greek mythology. This place became known as the Museum of Alexandria, from which we get the modern word museum. But unlike today's museums, which hold objects and artifacts, the original museum was more like a university, a research institute, and a library all in one. For 2 or 3 generations, the scientific work carried out at Alexandria was extraordinary. It became a magnet for some of the greatest minds the ancient world had ever produced. Let's name just a few of the stars in this dazzling constellation of knowledge. Euclid, the father of geometry. His book, The Elements, became the foundation of mathematics for over 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, who astonished the world by calculating the size of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. His estimate came within just 50 miles of the Earth's actual diameter. Apollonius, who explored the mysteries of conic sections, laying the groundwork for later discoveries in astronomy and physics. Hipparchus, who created the first accurate star map and cataloged hundreds of stars with astonishing precision. Hero of Alexandria, an inventor ahead of his time who built the very first known steam engine centuries before industrial machines ever existed. And then there was Archimedes, the brilliant mind from Syracuse. He traveled to Alexandria to study, learn, and collaborate. Though he lived far from Egypt, he frequently corresponded with the scholars of the museum, exchanging ideas that pushed science forward. Another notable figure was Herophilus, one of the greatest anatomists of the Greek world. He dared to explore the inner workings of the human body and is even said to have practiced vivisection, the dissection of living bodies, in order to better understand anatomy. A practice that would shock us today, but in his time, it reflected a deep, fearless drive to uncover the truths of human biology. Together, these thinkers transformed Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a place where curiosity was not only welcomed, but fully supported and celebrated. For a brief and brilliant period, roughly a generation or so during the reigns of Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II, the city of Alexandria witnessed a blaze of scientific discovery and intellectual progress unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a golden age of learning, a moment when the human mind seemed to leap forward. In fact, such a concentrated burst of knowledge and innovation would not appear again until the 16th century AD, nearly 1800 years later, during the European Renaissance. But sadly, this great momentum did not last. The flame that had burned so brightly at the Museum of Alexandria began to flicker and fade. Why? Historians have offered different explanations over the years, but one particularly insightful theory was proposed by the late Professor Mahaffy. He suggested that the root of the problem lay in the structure of the museum itself. You see, the museum wasn't an independent institution, it was a royal college. That meant every professor, every scholar, every researcher there was appointed and paid directly by the king, the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, this system worked wonderfully in the beginning when Pharaoh was Ptolemy I, a former student and close friend of Aristotle. He deeply valued reason, inquiry, and intellectual freedom. He understood what the museum was meant to be. But as the Ptolemaic dynasty continued, things changed. Later kings, the descendants of Ptolemy, began to lose touch with that original vision. They became increasingly Egyptianized, adopting more and more of the ancient local customs, religious beliefs, and ceremonial traditions. Gradually, they came under the influence of the Egyptian priesthood, who were far more concerned with ritual and spiritual authority than with open-ended scientific exploration. These later pharaohs stopped following the research. They no longer supported the spirit of discovery. Instead, they began to control it, managing scholars like court servants, limiting what could be studied, and putting religious orthodoxy above intellectual curiosity. And so, what had once been the greatest center of learning in the ancient world began to stagnate. The freedom to question, to explore boldly, to challenge ideas was slowly choked out. And without that freedom, the genius of the museum faded. After its first century of brilliance, it produced little of lasting value. The spark that once lit the world went dim. Ptolemy was not only a ruler, he was also a visionary, deeply committed to the pursuit of knowledge. With a remarkably modern mindset, he set out to do something that no one had ever done before, to organize the discovery of new knowledge and to preserve all existing wisdom for future generations. To accomplish this, he created what would become one of the most legendary institutions in all of history, the Library of Alexandria. This was not just a place where books were stored. It was designed to be something far greater, a vast, living archive of human thought. The goal of the library was bold: to collect every book, every scroll, every written work from across the known world. No matter the language, no matter the origin, if it held knowledge, they wanted it. But the Library of Alexandria was more than just a silent collection of old texts. It was also a place of action and production, a center for book copying and book selling on a massive scale. Ptolemy organized a great army of scribes and copyists who worked day and night. Their task was to create duplicate copies of every manuscript the library acquired so that the knowledge could be preserved, shared, and spread. This wasn't just preservation, it was reproduction and distribution. In this way, the library became a hub not only for scholars seeking knowledge, but for the circulation of that knowledge across lands and generations. It was, in spirit and function, the ancestor of the modern publishing house, the university archive, and the public library all rolled into one. And it stood as a testament to one man's belief that human wisdom should never be lost but should always grow, multiply, and light the path forward. Here, in this moment, with the founding of the museum and the Library of Alexandria, we see the first clear opening of the intellectual process that still defines the world we live in today. This wasn't just a golden chapter in ancient history, it was the beginning of something new, something enduring. For the first time, knowledge was not only being created, but also systematically gathered, organized, and shared. Ideas were no longer left to fade in isolation. They were preserved, duplicated, discussed, and passed from one generation to the next. This effort to collect and distribute human understanding was a turning point, a shift from scattered wisdom to structured learning. The creation of the museum and the Library of Alexandria marks one of the great milestones in the story of mankind. It was a bold declaration that truth matters, that knowledge must be preserved, and that the human mind has the power to shape the future. In every meaningful sense, this is the true beginning of modern history, a point where curiosity, reason, and the pursuit of understanding became the guiding light of civilization, a light that, even now, still burns. Both the pursuit of knowledge and the sharing of that knowledge faced serious limitations in ancient Alexandria. Despite all the brilliance of the museum and library, the intellectual world of that time was still held back by one major obstacle: a deep social divide. On one side stood the philosophers, the scholars and thinkers, often men of wealth and high status. On the other side were the artisans and tradesmen, the glassworkers, the metalsmiths, the craftsmen who shaped the material world. And between them stood a wall of silence. These groups did not collaborate. They did not share ideas. They did not speak the same intellectual language. There were incredibly skilled glassmakers in those days, people who created beautifully colored beads, bottles, and ornaments. But they weren't making lenses or clear glass fit for optical experiments. The idea of making a Florentine flask, or even thinking about how glass could be used to explore the world at the microscopic level, simply never emerged. There were expert metalworkers who crafted fine jewelry, detailed armor, and sharp weapons. But none of them thought to make a chemical balance, a tool that would become fundamental to the science of chemistry. Meanwhile, the philosophers, brilliant as they were, often remained aloof. They debated the nature of atoms and the structure of the cosmos, but they rarely got their hands dirty. They had little knowledge and even less interest in the materials that artisans worked with every day: paints, glazes, dyes, potions, metals. This separation between theory and practice meant that many of the scientific ideas born in Alexandria never turned into tools. They stayed as elegant thoughts, not engines, not instruments, not machines. Even Hero of Alexandria, who designed a primitive steam engine, never applied it to anything useful. It wasn't used to pump water or power a boat or do labor. It was a clever toy, not a revolution. Outside of medicine, there were few real-world applications of science. And without those practical uses to drive curiosity and investment, science failed to take root in everyday life. So when the intellectual spark of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II faded, the movement slowed. There was no momentum to carry it forward. The discoveries made at the Museum of Alexandria were preserved, yes, but only in obscure manuscripts, hidden away and forgotten by the wider world. And they would remain that way for centuries until the Renaissance, when the thirst for scientific understanding was reborn. Only then did those old ideas begin to reach the minds and hands of the masses. The great Library of Alexandria, for all its ambition and brilliance, did not lead to improvements in how books were made. Despite being the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, it failed to revolutionize the physical form of books themselves. In that era, there was no paper, as we know it today, no neatly sized sheets made from pulp. Paper was a Chinese invention, and it wouldn't make its way to the Western world until the 9th century AD, nearly 1,000 years after Alexandria's prime. Instead, the ancient world relied on two main materials: parchment, made from animal skin, and papyrus, made from reeds sliced into long strips, then glued edge to edge. These papyrus strips were rolled into scrolls, the standard format for ancient books. But scrolls were unwieldy. They had to be wound and unwound by hand, making them difficult to read and even harder to reference quickly. You couldn't flip through them. You couldn't scan them for a quote. There were no pages, only one long, fragile ribbon of text. This clumsy format, combined with the lack of cheap materials, prevented the development of the paged and printed book, the codex, which would come much later in history. And while printing in some basic form did exist, seals were used in ancient Sumeria, and there's even evidence of printed symbols going back to the Old Stone Age, it never evolved into book printing. Why? Because without abundant, inexpensive paper, printing books offered little advantage. Even if you had the technology, you had nothing cheap to print on. There may have been resistance as well from the powerful class of professional scribes and copyists. Their livelihoods depended on hand copying texts. And like many guilds or trade groups throughout history, they may have opposed any method that threatened to replace their work with machines or stamps. So, while Alexandria produced books in great numbers, it did not produce cheap books. Knowledge remained expensive and tightly held. It never spread downward into the general population. It stayed locked within the hands of the wealthy, the powerful, and the elite. The dream of universal learning, of books for every home, of education for every class, would have to wait many more centuries. And so, despite all its brilliance, all its boldness, this great blaze of intellectual activity in Alexandria never truly spread beyond a small, privileged circle. Only those who were directly connected to the group of philosophers gathered by Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II ever felt its warmth. To the rest of the world, it was like a light hidden inside a dark lantern. Inside, the flame might have burned brightly, even blindingly. But from the outside, there was no glow, no guidance, no visible sign that something extraordinary was happening. While minds were awakening in the halls of the museum, the rest of the world went on, unchanged, still walking old roads, still thinking in old ways, completely unaware that the seeds of science had been planted. Seeds that, one day, would revolutionize everything, but that moment would not come quickly. Soon, even Alexandria itself fell into darkness, a darkness brought on by bigotry, fear, and the slow suffocation of free thought. The flame that had once burned so brightly was extinguished, and the seed, the fragile idea that Aristotle had sown, lay buried, unseen, unnurtured, forgotten. For 1,000 years, the world remained in shadow. And then, slowly, silently, the seed began to stir. It germinated. It reached upward. And when it finally broke the surface, it grew fast, into a vast, unstoppable wave of knowledge and clarity. In just a few centuries, it spread across the globe, reshaping human life, rewriting our understanding of the universe, and lighting the way toward the modern world we now live in. That tiny flame, hidden for so long, had at last become a rising sun. Alexandria, for all its fame, was not the only center of Greek intellectual life during the 3rd century BC. All across the fractured remains of Alexander's short-lived empire, there were other cities where thought, science, and culture continued to shine. One such city was Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily. For nearly 2 centuries, Syracuse was home to remarkable advances in both science and philosophy, a beacon of learning on the western edge of the Hellenic world. Far to the east, in Asia Minor, the city of Pergamum also rose to prominence. It too had a great library, and became known for its contributions to knowledge and artistic life. In many ways, the brilliance of Greek civilization seemed to scatter and bloom in pockets across the Mediterranean and beyond, like sparks still glowing in the ashes of empire. But this flourishing Greek world was about to face a series of devastating blows. New waves of invaders, Nordic barbarians, known as the Gauls, came roaring down from the north. They followed the same ancient paths once walked by the ancestors of the Greeks, the Phrygians, and the Macedonians. But these new arrivals came not with ideas, but with destruction. They raided, they shattered, they burned. In the wake of their chaos came another, far more organized power, a people rising from Italy, the Romans. The Romans were strong, disciplined, and determined. They gradually conquered and absorbed the western half of the once great realm that had belonged to Darius and Alexander. But they were also a practical people more interested in law and profit than in science or art. They valued order over imagination and structure over speculation. While the West fell under Roman rule, the East faced invasions of its own. Out of Central Asia came a new wave of conquerors, the Parthians. They were fierce warriors, known for their deadly mounted archers, and they swept across the eastern territories of the former empire. They shattered the Seleucid Empire, cutting off the Western world once again from India and the riches of the East. To the once great Greco-Persian cities of Persepolis and Susa, they brought the same ruin and conquest that the Medes and Persians had delivered centuries earlier. And still, they were not the last. From the far northeast, new peoples began to emerge. These were not the tall, fair-skinned, Aryan-speaking tribes of earlier migrations. They were yellow-skinned, black-haired, and spoke languages of Mongolian origin, a sign of even greater changes to come. But of these new nomads and the world they would shape, we shall speak in a chapter yet to come, Confucius and Lao Tse. We now come to 2 extraordinary figures from ancient China, Confucius and Lao Tse. They lived during one of the most remarkable centuries in human history, the 6th century BC. This was a time often described as the adolescence of mankind, when human thought began to grow deeper, more reflective, and more powerful. So far in this story of civilization, we have spoken very little about the early history of China. That is not because China lacked importance, but because much of its ancient past still remains hidden and unclear. Unlike Europe or the Middle East, where archaeology has revealed a vast record of early life, China's beginnings are still being uncovered. But that is now changing. As a new China rises in the modern age, we look to Chinese archaeologists and historians to explore their own rich past, just as Europe did during the last 2 centuries. What we do know is that very long ago, the earliest Chinese civilizations emerged in the great river valleys of the region. These early societies developed from what scholars call the primordial Heliolithic culture, a common pattern seen in many of the world's first civilizations. Like the peoples of Egypt and Sumeria, early Chinese communities were centered around temples. Priests and priest kings led religious rituals, including seasonal blood sacrifices, believed to maintain balance with the heavens and the earth. The life in those cities must have been very similar to what existed in Egypt or Sumeria 6 or 7,000 years ago. In fact, it also closely resembled the cities of the Maya in Central America just 1,000 years ago. So, while China's early story is still unfolding, one thing is clear. It was part of that larger shared human journey, a world shaped by rivers, ruled by ritual, and destined to give rise to great minds like Confucius and Lao Tse. If there were human sacrifices in ancient China, they had already faded into the past by the time recorded history began. By the dawn of history, such practices had long been replaced by animal sacrifices, which became the central form of ritual offering in early Chinese religious life. This shift reflects an important transformation in values and beliefs, a move away from the most extreme expressions of devotion toward more symbolic and ceremonial acts. At the same time, another crucial development was unfolding. A form of picture writing, what we now recognize as the early stages of Chinese script, was already beginning to emerge. This written language was taking shape long before 1000 years B.C. It started with symbols and pictographs, slowly evolving into a more complex system of communication. And this early writing would go on to become one of the most enduring and sophisticated writing systems in the world. So even in these early times, China was already laying the foundations for a civilization built not just on power and ritual, but on memory, language, and recorded thought. Just as the early civilizations of Europe and Western Asia were often in conflict with nomads from the deserts and the northern plains, the primitive Chinese civilizations also faced constant pressure from vast groups of nomadic peoples living along their northern borders. These northern tribes were many in number, but they shared similar ways of life and spoke related languages. Over time, they appear in history under different names: the Huns, the Mongols, the Turks, and the Tartars. They changed names, split apart, merged, and reformed again and again, much like the Nordic tribes of Northern Europe and Central Asia. Their identities shifted with time, but their essential nature remained. Interestingly, these Mongolian nomads had access to horses earlier than the Nordic peoples, and it is possible that somewhere in the region of the Altai Mountains, they even made their own independent discovery of iron sometime after 1000 BC. Much like what happened in the Western world, these Eastern nomads would, from time to time, achieve a kind of political unity. When that happened, they became a powerful force, often sweeping down into the more settled and civilized regions to conquer, rule, and sometimes even revive the cultures they had overcome. This rhythm of movement between the wandering tribes of the steppe and the cities of settled peoples would shape Chinese history for centuries to come. It is quite possible that the earliest civilization of China was not Mongolian at all, just as the earliest civilizations of Europe and Western Asia were neither Nordic nor Semitic. In fact, some scholars believe that the first advanced societies in China may have belonged to a brunette race, sharing a cultural thread with the earliest Egyptian, Sumerian, and Dravidian civilizations. And by the time China's recorded history begins, there may already have been waves of conquest, settlement, and intermixture that reshaped the land and its people. What we do know is this: by around 1750 BC, China was already a vast and complex network of small kingdoms and city-states. Each of these local rulers acknowledged, at least in theory, the authority of a single great figure, a priest-emperor known as the Son of Heaven. These kingdoms paid tribute in varying degrees of loyalty and consistency, forming a kind of loose feudal system under the spiritual leadership of this central ruler. This early phase of Chinese history was marked by the rule of the Shang dynasty, which lasted until 1125 BC. It was then followed by the Chao dynasty, which held China together, though only loosely, for several centuries. During the long Chao period, China slowly began to fragment. Unity faded. Hunnish tribes pushed down from the north and established their own principalities. Local rulers stopped paying tribute, declared independence, and formed their own centers of power. By the 6th century BC, according to one Chinese authority, there were as many as 5,000 or 6,000 practically independent states within the Chinese world. This period of intense political chaos and division is remembered in Chinese history as an age of confusion. And it was in the midst of this confusion, this disunity, that voices like Confucius and Lao Tse began to speak, offering not just wisdom, but a vision of how civilization itself might be healed. But even though it was known as an age of confusion, this period in Chinese history was not without light. Despite the political fragmentation and the countless independent states, there was still room for deep intellectual activity. Art, culture, and refined ways of living continued to flourish in many local centers across the land. In fact, when we come to know more about the rich tapestry of Chinese history, we may discover that ancient China had its own versions of Miletus and Athens, its own Pergamum and Macedonia. In other words, there were cities and regions where thought, creativity, and learning blossomed, even during times of political disunity. Unfortunately, our understanding of this particular period is still limited. So for now, we must speak only in broad terms, vague and brief. The details are still too uncertain, too fragmented, for us to shape a clear and continuous story. But what is certain is this: even in times of division, the human spirit continues to seek knowledge, express beauty, and strive for meaning. And that perhaps is the true mark of a lasting civilization. Just as divided Greece produced its philosophers, and just as the shattered and captive Jewish people gave rise to their prophets, so too, in disordered China, there emerged great thinkers and teachers during this turbulent time. In all of these civilizations, it seems that insecurity and uncertainty did not suppress the mind, but rather awakened it. Troubled times stirred the deeper thoughts of those who sought meaning, wisdom, and order in a chaotic world. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge from ancient China was Confucius. He came from an aristocratic background and held a position of official importance in a small state called Lu. Like the philosophers of Greece, Confucius was deeply troubled by the lawlessness and disorder he saw around him. In response, he founded something very much like an academy, a place devoted to discovering and teaching wisdom. He believed in the possibility of a better life through better government, through ethical leadership, and through education. With this vision in his heart, he traveled from state to state across China, searching for a ruler who would adopt his ideas and implement his reforms. Though he found a prince who seemed promising, court politics and intrigues soon rose against him. In the end, Confucius saw his proposals ignored and his dream of reform quietly defeated. It is interesting to note that about 1.5 centuries later, the Greek philosopher Plato had a similar experience. He too sought out a ruler who might help him bring philosophical ideals into practice, and for a time he served as advisor to Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily. Both Confucius and Plato dreamed of wise leadership. Both believed that truth and virtue could guide nations, and both in the end saw the difficulty of bringing wisdom into the halls of power. Confucius died a disappointed man. In the final years of his life, he felt his efforts had been in vain. "No intelligent ruler arises to take me as his master," he said, "and my time has come to die." Yet, what Confucius could not see in those quiet, fading years was that his teaching held far more life than he imagined. Though he left the world feeling unheard, his ideas would echo for centuries. His philosophy would go on to shape the very soul of Chinese civilization. It became a guiding force, not just a collection of moral rules, but a living framework for society, leadership, family, and thought. Over time, Confucianism became one of what the Chinese people call the three teachings. The other two were the teachings of Buddha and of Lao Tse. Together, these three systems of belief would influence the minds, values, and lives of millions, forming the foundation of Chinese thought for generations to come. The gist of the teaching of Confucius was the way of the noble or aristocratic man. He was concerned with personal conduct as much as Gautama was concerned with the peace of self-forgetfulness, and the Greek with external knowledge, and the Jew with righteousness. He was the most public-minded of all great teachers. He was supremely concerned by the confusion and miseries of the world, and he wanted to make men noble in order to bring about a noble world. He sought to regulate conduct to an extraordinary extent, to provide sound rules for every occasion in life. A polite, public-spirited gentleman, rather sternly self-disciplined, was the ideal he found already developing in the northern Chinese world and one to which he gave a permanent form. The core of Confucius's teaching was centered on the idea of the noble man, not noble by birth, but noble in character and conduct. While Gautama Buddha focused on inner peace through self-forgetfulness, and the Greek philosophers sought external knowledge, and the Jewish prophets emphasized righteousness, Confucius was most deeply concerned with personal behavior and public life. Among all the great teachers of history, he was perhaps the most public-minded. He looked out at the world disordered, suffering, and confused and longed to make it better. His answer was simple, yet profound. To create a noble world, he believed, you must first create noble individuals. Confucius believed that true nobility came through discipline, learning, and virtue. He sought to regulate human conduct to an extraordinary degree, offering thoughtful guidance for every stage, every role, and every situation in life. The ideal man, in his view, was polite, public-spirited, and firmly self-disciplined. This figure, the gentleman, or Chunzi, was already beginning to emerge in the northern Chinese world. Confucius gave this ideal a lasting form, shaping it into a model that would influence Chinese society for centuries. To him, dignity, respect, and moral strength were not just personal traits, but tools to heal a broken world. The teaching of Lao Tse was very different from that of Confucius. For many years, Lao Tse served as the keeper of the imperial library under the Zhou dynasty. His outlook, however, was far more mystical, vague, and elusive. Unlike Confucius, who focused on clear rules and public virtue, Lao Tse seemed to encourage a kind of detachment, a stoic indifference to the pleasures and ambitions of the world. He spoke of a return to a simpler, purer way of life, an imaginary age of peace and natural harmony long lost in the past. His writings were brief, cryptic, and often difficult to understand. He spoke in riddles and poetic phrases, offering glimpses of meaning rather than direct instruction. After his death, Lao Tse's teachings, much like those of Gautama Buddha, were gradually transformed. Legends began to form around his name. Layer upon layer of superstition and ritual were added to his original words. Complex ceremonies, magical beliefs, and strange observances slowly attached themselves to his philosophy. In China, just as in India, ancient magical thinking and mythic traditions from the earliest stages of human culture rose up to meet the newer ideas of wisdom and reflection. And in many ways, they overwhelmed them. Over time, both Buddhism and Taoism, the latter claiming Lao Tse as its founder, evolved into formal religions filled with temples, monks, priests, and ritual offerings. In appearance and practice, they often resembled the sacrificial religions of ancient Sumeria and Egypt, even if their underlying philosophies had once been more thoughtful and refined. But Confucianism was different. Because it was limited, plain, and straightforward, it resisted Zhuge distortions. It remained grounded, practical, accessible, and focused on the real world. And so, while other teachings were hidden under layers of myth and magic, the voice of Confucius continued to speak clearly through the centuries. North China, the land shaped by the Huanghe River, became deeply Confucian in both thought and spirit. It embraced order, discipline, and tradition, reflecting the teachings of Confucius in its institutions and values. Meanwhile, South China, the region along the Yangtze River, followed a different path. It became more Taoist in character, drawn to the mystical, the artistic, and the free-spirited nature of Lao Tse's vision. Since those ancient days, a quiet but constant tension has existed in Chinese life, a contrast between these two guiding spirits, the spirit of the North and the spirit of the South. In more recent times, this difference has been seen in the rivalry between the cities of Pekin and Nankin. Pekin, representing the North, is often associated with official-mindedness, upright conduct, and a deeply conservative outlook. Nankin, in the South, reflects a more skeptical, artistic, and experimental spirit, one that values flexibility over form and creativity over control. This quiet division between structure and spontaneity, reason, and mystery has shaped the course of Chinese history in subtle and lasting ways. The divisions that plagued China during the Long Age of Confucian reached their lowest point in the 6th century BC. The ruling Zhou dynasty had become so weak, so discredited that it could no longer command respect or hold the country together. Even Lao Tse, once a respected figure at the imperial court, left in quiet disillusionment and withdrew into private life. At that time, three major powers, all supposedly subordinate to the Chao emperor, were now in control. These were T's and T's in the north, and Chu, a strong military force based in the Yangtze Valley. Eventually, Tsi and Tsin formed an alliance. Together, they defeated Chu and imposed a broad treaty of disarmament and peace across China. Among the two allies, Tsin emerged as the stronger power and slowly became the dominant force in the land. Finally, around the same time that Asoka ruled in India, the Tsin monarch made a bold move. He seized the sacred sacrificial vessels of the declining Chao emperor and took over the emperor's ceremonial duties himself. This act was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that the old order had ended. His son, Shi Huangti, came to power as king in 246 BC and later crowned himself emperor in 220 BC. In the Chinese chronicles, he is remembered as the first universal emperor. Unlike Alexander the Great, whose reign was brief and whose empire quickly fragmented, Shi Huangti ruled with strength and stability for 36 years, both as king and as emperor. His reign marked the beginning of a new era of unity and prosperity for the Chinese people. He launched vigorous campaigns against the Hunnish invaders from the northern deserts, and it was under his direction that work began on one of the greatest construction efforts in human history, the Great Wall of China, built to shield the nation from the endless tide of nomadic raids. The Age of the Coal Swamps. In the distant primordial epoch, known as the Age of the Coal Swamps, a time when the world was still young and unformed, the vast expanses of land stretched out in desolate, uninviting silence, utterly devoid of the vibrant pulse of life. Picture, if you will, a barren, rugged landscape where craggy peaks and towering uplands of stark, unyielding rock stood resolute beneath the relentless gaze of the sun, its golden rays spilling across the jagged surfaces, casting long, melancholic shadows that danced lazily in the warm, unhurried breezes. The rain, too, fell in gentle, rhythmic patterns, cascading over these ancient stones, wearing them down ever so slowly, drop by patient drop, in a timeless ritual of nature's quiet persistence. Yet, despite the sun's warmth and the rain's tender caress, the land remained stubbornly lifeless, a silent witness to an era untouched by the bustling vitality we now associate with the Earth's surface. There was no trace of fertile, nurturing soil, for the humble earthworm, that tireless architect of rich, loamy earth, had not yet emerged to weave its intricate magic through the ground, breaking down the rocky debris into soft, life-giving mold. Nor were there any verdant plants, with their delicate roots and sprawling leaves, to fracture the unyielding stone into fine, crumbling particles, or to carpet the barren expanse with the vibrant hues of green. Moss, with its soft, velvety embrace, and lichen, with its intricate, crusty patterns, were nowhere to be found, their absence leaving the rocky terrain stark and unadorned, a canvas untouched by the brush of life. Indeed, in this remote and tranquil age, life itself was confined solely to the vast, shimmering depths of the sea, where it thrived in mysterious, fluid abundance, hidden beneath the waves, far from the desolate, sunlit crags and rain-soaked uplands of the silent, lifeless land. Across the vast, desolate expanse of this ancient world, where barren, unyielding rock stretched endlessly beneath the open sky, there unfolded a grand, almost theatrical procession of climatic transformations, each shift as profound as it was mysterious, weaving a tapestry of change that danced slowly across the eons. The causes of these sweeping alterations in the Earth's climate, dear listener, were intricate and multifaceted. A complex symphony of cosmic and terrestrial forces, still awaiting the full measure of human understanding, their secrets locked deep within the annals of geological time. Consider, for a moment, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifting of the Earth's orbit, its elliptical path around the sun stretching and contracting in a slow, celestial waltz, altering the angle and intensity of the sunlight that bathed the planet's rugged surface. Then, too, there was the gradual, ponderous drift of the poles of rotation, a quiet reorientation of the Earth's axis, tilting and swaying ever so slightly over countless millennia, redirecting the flow of seasons and climates across the globe. The continents themselves, those great ponderous slabs of stone, were not static, their shapes morphed and reshaped, their edges buckling and folding under the relentless pressures of the Earth's restless crust, carving new outlines that reshaped the boundaries between land and sea. Perhaps, even, there were subtle fluctuations in the warmth of the sun itself, its radiant energy waxing and waning in cycles too vast for mortal comprehension, now dimming to cast a chill across the world, now glowing with renewed vigor to bathe the planet in warmth. Together, these forces conspired, in a grand and silent accord, to plunge vast swaths of the Earth's surface into prolonged epochs of biting cold, where ice and frost cloaked the barren rocks in glistening, crystalline sheets, locking the land in a frozen embrace for millennia. Yet, in other times, these same forces ushered in long, languorous ages of warmth, where an equable, temperate climate spread its gentle influence across the planet, softening the harsh edges of the rocky terrain with a soothing, sunlit calm that endured for millions upon millions of years. There were periods, too, of tremendous internal upheaval when the Earth's restless heart stirred with fiery vigor, and over the course of a few million years, accumulated pressures deep within the planet's core burst forth in spectacular displays of volcanic fury, spewing molten rock and ash in fiery torrents, while great upheavals reshaped the very outlines of mountains and continents. These cataclysms deepened the oceans, raised the peaks of towering mountains to new heights, and sharpened the contrast between the extremes of climate, rendering the world a place of dramatic highs and lows. Yet, following these turbulent epochs, there came vast, tranquil ages of comparative stillness when the forces of frost, the gentle patter of rain, and the ceaseless flow of rivers worked patiently to erode the lofty mountain heights, grinding their jagged summits into fine, silken dust. This sediment, carried in great sluggish rivers, settled into the sea, filling its depths and raising its floors, spreading the waters ever shallower and wider, until they lapped gently over more and more of the land, cloaking it in a serene, liquid embrace. Thus, the Earth's history unfolded in alternating chapters of grandeur and reposages when the world stood high and deep, with towering peaks and profound ocean trenches, and others when it lay low and level, its surface smoothed into gentle plains and shallow seas. Let the reader cast aside any notion that the Earth's surface has grown steadily cooler since its molten crust first hardened into solid rock. No, once that initial cooling had sculpted the planet's outer shell, the internal fires ceased to dominate the conditions above. Yet, even in the remote Ozoic period, long before life stirred on land, there are whispers in the stone traces of times when ice and snow reigned supreme, blanketing the world in glacial ages, their frosty legacy etched into the very rocks that endured those ancient, frozen dreams. As the age of fishes, that ancient and aquatic chapter of Earth's long history, drew toward its quiet, unhurried close, a profound and wondrous transformation began to unfold, a delicate yet momentous shift in the tapestry of life itself. Across the world, vast, shimmering expanses of shallow seas stretched out, their gentle waves lapping lazily against the edges of tranquil lagoons where the waters, warm and sunlit, cradled an abundance of life in their tender, liquid embrace. It was here, in these serene, shallow realms, where the boundaries between sea and land blurred into a soft, inviting gradient, that life resilient, persistent, and ever adapting began to venture forth, tentatively at first, from the familiar depths of the oceans onto the uncharted, rocky shores of the terrestrial world. For countless millennia, one must imagine the earliest precursors of these pioneering forms, those strange and wondrous creatures that would soon proliferate in great numbers, had been evolving in the shadows of obscurity, their development a slow, almost imperceptible process, unfolding over scores upon scores of millions of years. These ancient organisms, hidden in the quiet corners of the seas, had been patiently refining their forms, adapting in rare and subtle ways, their existence a mere whisper in the vast symphony of the ocean's teeming life. Yet, as the Earth's landscape shifted and the shallow seas spread wide, a golden opportunity arose, a moment when the conditions of the world aligned to beckon these humble beings toward a new frontier. The warm, placid waters of the lagoons, fringed with soft sediments and bathed in the gentle glow of the sun, offered a bridge between the aqueous cradle of life and the stark, untested land beyond. And so, With a quiet courage born of eons of preparation, life seized this chance, spreading itself in an effectual and purposeful manner from the nurturing embrace of the seas onto the barren, sun-warmed rocks of the terrestrial realm, where it would begin to weave a new chapter in the grand, unending story of existence. In the tranquil twilight of the age of fishes, as the earth's shallow seas and sun-dappled lagoons whispered of change, a grand and silent migration began to unfold, a delicate procession of life that would forever alter the face of the barren, rocky world. First to venture forth, with a quiet determination born of eons, were the plants, those humble pioneers of the terrestrial realm, bravely stepping out from the nurturing embrace of the waters to claim the sunlit shores. These verdant trailblazers no doubt preceded their animal counterparts, leading the way in this bold invasion of the land, yet the animals, ever watchful and adaptive, followed closely in their wake, their movements a soft echo of the plants' pioneering journey. For the plants, dear listener, the challenges of this new frontier were formidable, yet their solutions were nothing short of miraculous. The first great puzzle they faced was how to stand tall, to hold their delicate fronds aloft toward the golden rays of the sun when the buoyant, supportive waters of their aquatic cradle were no longer there to cradle them. Without the gentle lift of the waves, they needed a means of sturdy, unyielding support to defy the pull of gravity. The second challenge, no less daunting, was the task of drawing precious water from the damp, swampy ground below, transporting it through their tissues to sustain their growth now that the life-giving liquid was no longer all around them, ready at hand. With an ingenuity born of nature's patient evolution, the plants devised a remarkable solution, the development of woody tissue, a marvel of biological architecture that served a dual purpose. This resilient, fibrous structure not only provided the strength to hold the plant upright, its fronds reaching eagerly for the sunlight, but also acted as an intricate network of conduits, channeling water from the sodden earth below to the thirsty leaves above, ensuring their survival in this strange, dry world. And so, as if by some grand decree of the earth itself, the record of the rocks, that ancient chronicle of time, became suddenly and gloriously crowded with a vast profusion of woody swamp plants, their forms as varied as they were magnificent. There were towering tree mosses, their lush, feathery canopies swaying gently in the warm, humid air. There were majestic tree ferns, their broad, lacy fronds unfurling like delicate tapestries beneath the sun, and there were gigantic horsetails, their segmented stalks rising like ancient columns from the marshy ground, a testament to life's relentless ambition. With these botanical pioneers, age upon slow, unhurried age, there emerged from the shimmering waters an equally diverse parade of animal forms, each more curious and remarkable than the last. Picture, if you will, the soft rustle of centipedes and millipedes, their many legs scuttling across the damp earth, their segmented bodies weaving through the undergrowth with a quiet, purposeful grace. The first primitive insects, delicate and tentative, took wing in the warm, misty air, their fragile forms a whisper of life in the stillness of the land. There were creatures, too, distant kin to the ancient king crabs and sea scorpions, which, with a bold and daring evolution, transformed into the earliest spiders and land scorpions, their forms adapted to the challenges of this new terrestrial domain. And then, in a crowning moment of life's unfolding saga, there appeared vertebrated animals, their sturdy spines a harbinger of the complex creatures yet to come, each step onto the land a quiet triumph in the long, dreamlike journey of existence. In that ancient, mist-shrouded epoch known as the Age of the Coal Swamps, when the earth was still a young and verdant canvas of swampy lagoons and sprawling shallow seas, there thrived a remarkable array of creatures, among them some of the earliest insects, whose forms were as astonishing as they were grand. Picture, if you will, dear listener, a world where the warm, humid air hummed with the soft, delicate flutter of wings that belonged to insects of such extraordinary size that they seemed to belong to a realm of dreams rather than reality. Among these early pioneers of the terrestrial skies were the dragonflies, majestic and awe-inspiring, their delicate, translucent wings stretching out in a breathtaking span, some reaching an almost unimaginable width of 29 inches, a testament to the boundless creativity of nature's design. These magnificent creatures, with their shimmering wings glinting in the soft, dappled sunlight that filtered through the towering fronds of tree ferns and horsetails, glided gracefully over the marshy landscapes, their movement a slow, hypnotic dance that seemed to echo the unhurried rhythm of the ancient world itself. Each beat of their expansive wings, delicate yet powerful, stirred the warm, moist air, creating faint ripples that whispered through the stillness of the swamp, a gentle reminder of life's quiet, persistent march across the newly claimed land. In the gentle, mist-laden dawn of the age of the coal swamps, as life began its tentative yet wondrous exploration of the terrestrial world, a profound transformation unfolded among the creatures that had once known only the embrace of the seas. These new orders and genera, emerging from the warm, shallow waters of ancient lagoons, embarked on a remarkable journey of adaptation, mastering the art of breathing air in a variety of ingenious and delicate ways, each a testament to the relentless ingenuity of life's evolution. Up until this moment, dear listener, all animals had relied upon the air dissolved within the liquid cradle of the oceans, their gills sifting oxygen from water with a quiet, rhythmic efficiency that had sustained them for countless eons. Even today, in truth, all creatures must draw upon moisture to facilitate this vital exchange, for the act of breathing is, at its core, a dance between air and water within the delicate tissues of the body. Imagine then the challenge faced by these pioneering animals as they ventured onto the dry, unyielding land where the air was no longer filtered through the comforting medium of water. A human being, for instance, with a perfectly dry lung would find themselves gasping, suffocating, for the surfaces of the lungs must remain moist, glistening with a delicate sheen to allow the life-giving oxygen to pass seamlessly into the bloodstream, nourishing the body with every breath. The adaptation to air breathing, a marvel of nature's patient craftsmanship, took many forms, each as intricate as it was essential. In some creatures, the ancient gills, once perfectly suited to their aquatic origins, were gently cloaked with protective covers, a delicate shield to prevent the evaporation of precious moisture, preserving their function in this new arid world. In others, entirely new breathing organs emerged. Intricate tubes or specialized structures nestled deep within the body, kept moist by a watery secretion that mimicked the nurturing environment of the sea. For the vertebrated lineage, those noble ancestors of the fish that would one day give rise to creatures such as ourselves, the old gills proved ill-suited to the demands of terrestrial life, their delicate fronds too prone to drying in the open air. Instead, a remarkable innovation arose, born from an unlikely source, the swimming bladder of the fish, a buoyant sac that had once aided in their graceful navigation of the ocean's depths. This humble structure, through the slow, patient hand of evolution, transformed into a new, deep-seated breathing organothalunga marvel of biological reinvention that allowed these creatures to draw air directly from the atmosphere. Among the creatures that emerged in this era were the amphibia, ancestors of the frogs and newts that grace our world today, whose lives tell a story of transition as beautiful as it is complex. These creatures begin their existence in the gentle embrace of the water, their delicate gills fluttering softly as they extract oxygen from their liquid surroundings, just as their ancient forebears had done. Yet as they grow, a remarkable metamorphosis unfolds, the lung developing as a bag-like outgrowth from the throat, much like the swimming bladder of their Piscean kin, gradually assumes the sacred task of breathing. With this newfound gift, the animal ventures forth, stepping cautiously onto the land, where the air is crisp and unfiltered. The gills, once vital, begin to dwindle, their delicate structures fading away, while the gill slits themselves close, save for one remarkable remnantan outgrowth of a single gill slit that transforms into the passage of the ear and the drum-like membrane that captures the sounds of the world. Thus equipped, the amphibian becomes a creature of the air, its lungs filling with the breath of the terrestrial realm, yet it remains forever tethered to its aquatic origins, for it must return, at least to the water's edge, to lay its eggs and perpetuate its kind, a quiet reminder of the ancient seas from which all life once emerged. In the lush, mist-enshrouded world of the age of the coal swamps, where the boundaries between land and water blurred into a soft, verdant embrace, all the air-breathing vertebrates that roam the nascent terrestrial realm belong to that remarkable class known as the amphibia, creatures whose very existence was a delicate bridge between the ancient seas and the newly claimed shores. These beings, dear listener, were kin to the newts that grace our modern ponds and streams, their forms echoing the quiet elegance of their descendants, Yet some among them grew to sizes that inspire awe, their robust bodies moving with a deliberate, almost dreamlike grace through the humid, fern-laden landscapes. They were, indeed, creatures of the land, their lungs drawing in the warm, moist air with a